Imagine this. You're sitting in a darkened movie theater, popcorn in hand, watching a muscled hero stride across the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum. The crowd roars, women swoon, the emperor himself leans forward, captivated by this warrior's defiance. Our gladiator hero raises his sword to the sky, and in that moment, he's not a slave, he's a god. Now forget everything you just imagined. Throw it in the trash along with your popcorn, because Hollywood has been lying to you for decades. The truth about being a Roman gladiator wasn't heroic. It wasn't glorious. It was, to use the technical historical term, absolutely miserable. Now here's the real picture. You wake up in a cell that smells like a mixture of sweat, blood, and whatever died under your straw mattress 3 weeks ago. Your body aches from yesterday's training, where a retired gladiator beat you with a stick for 6 hours straight because your footwork was an insult to the gods. You're about to eat your breakfast, a delightful bowl of barley porridge that has the consistency of wet cement and tastes like someone already digested it once. In a few hours, you'll be back in the training yard, preparing for a career where your retirement plan is hoping someone stabs you somewhere non-fatal. Welcome to the real life of a Roman gladiator, where the only thing more damaged than your body was your social status. You see, gladiators occupied a fascinating position in Roman society. They were simultaneously superstars and social pariahs, sex symbols and untouchables, wealthy celebrities and legal non-persons. Imagine being as famous as a modern sports star, but with the social standing of a prostitute, and you're getting close to the bizarre reality of gladiatorial life. The Romans had a special word for people like gladiators, infamia. It literally means without fame or disgrace. But what it really meant was that you were legally ruined. An infamous couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, couldn't testify in court, and couldn't even be buried in a regular cemetery. You were literally too disreputable to rot next to normal Roman citizens. But here's where it gets really twisted. Despite this legal and social death sentence, gladiators were everywhere in Roman culture. Their faces were scratched into walls as graffiti. Upper-class women collected their sweat in little vials as an aphrodisiac. Yes, really. Kids played with little clay gladiator figures the way modern children play with action figures. The same society that legally classified gladiators alongside pimps and actors also couldn't get enough of them. This paradox, being simultaneously worshipped and reviled, was just one layer of the multi-layered shit sandwich that was a gladiator's life. But to really understand why being a gladiator sucked so monumentally, we need to start at the beginning. We need to understand how someone ended up in this profession in the first place. Because despite what Hollywood might have you believe, nobody grew up dreaming of being a gladiator. Nobody's career counselor suggested professional stabbing victim as a viable career path. The path to the arena was paved with desperation, coercion, and the kind of life choices that make you wonder if maybe getting eaten by a lion might not be such a bad retirement plan after all. Let's clear something up right away. Despite what Russell Crowe might have led you to believe, most gladiators didn't choose their profession after giving an inspiring speech about strength and honor. The vast majority of gladiators became gladiators the same way most people become anything they don't want to be, through a spectacular combination of bad luck, worse circumstances, and the kind of life decisions that seem reasonable only when the alternative is starving to death. There were essentially 3 paths to the arena, and none of them started with follow your dreams. The most traditional way to become a gladiator was to have the misfortune of fighting against Rome and losing. This was like applying for a job by getting your entire civilization destroyed. The Romans had a charmingly practical approach to prisoners of war. Instead of the modern Geneva Convention, they had what we might call the Arena Convention. Surrender in battle, and will give you the exciting opportunity to die for entertainment instead of dying on the battlefield. Imagine you're a Gallic warrior. You've spent your whole life training with a sword, building your reputation, maybe even getting one of those fancy mustaches the Gauls were famous for. Then the Romans show up with their matching shields and distressing efficiency at wholesale slaughter. Your choices are die fighting or surrender and hope for the best. You choose surrender because, hey, you're an optimist. Congratulations, you've just won an all-expenses-paid trip to Rome, where all expenses means chains and paid means you're now property. But the Romans, being the marketing geniuses they were, didn't just throw you in the arena immediately. No, that would be wasteful. First, they'd train you, feed you, and turn you into a proper gladiator. They'd even name your fighting style after your people, Gallus, Thrax, Samnite, so that every time you fought, you were basically a living, breathing reminder of Roman military dominance. It was like forcing the defeated players of the losing Super Bowl team to reenact their loss every Sunday for the rest of their lives, except with more stabbing and a significant chance of death. The second path to gladiatorial glory was through Rome's criminal justice system, which had all the compassion of a sledgehammer and twice the subtlety. Roman law had 2 delightful sentences for serious criminals that involved the arena. Damnatio ad gladium, condemnation to the sword, was the worst of the 2. This wasn't gladiator training. This was a death sentence with extra steps. You'd be given a sword and told to fight another condemned criminal. The winner got to fight another condemned criminal. This continued until only one person was left, at which point a professional gladiator or executioner would kill them. It was like a tournament where the grand prize was dying slightly later than everyone else. Damnatio ad ludum, condemnation to the games, was marginally better, in the same way that getting punched in the face is marginally better than getting hit with a bat. This sentence condemned you to train and fight as a gladiator for a specific period, usually 3 to 5 years. If you survived, and that was a spectacular if, you could theoretically win your freedom. The survival rate was approximately as good as you'd expect for a profession where a workplace accident meant sword through the liver. The crimes that could get you these sentences ranged from murder and robbery to the heinous offense of being Christian during the wrong emperor's reign. Sometimes, all it took was pissing off the wrong wealthy Roman who had connections. Justice was blind, but she had a great sense of humor and a season pass to the games. Here's where things get really depressing. By the late Republic, a shocking number of gladiators, perhaps as many as half, were volunteers. Free Roman citizens who looked at the life of a gladiator, with its violence, degradation, and near certain death, and said, "Sign me up." These volunteers, called auctorati, weren't thrill seekers or glory hounds. They were desperate. The primary motivation was debt. Crushing, soul-destroying debt that would otherwise lead to debt slavery. For a Roman citizen facing financial ruin, becoming a gladiator offered a signing bonus that could clear their debts. It was like taking out a payday loan, except the interest rate was probably dying in front of a cheering crowd. To become an auctoratus, you couldn't just wander into a gladiator school and fill out an application. You needed a magistrate's permission, had to pass a physical exam, and then came the fun part, swearing the Sacramentum Gladiatorium, the gladiator's oath. This wasn't your standard terms of service agreement. This was a legally binding promise to allow yourself to be, and I quote, burned, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword. Let that sink in. You're literally signing a contract that says, I consent to being set on fire, tied up, beaten senseless, and murdered. It's like the world's worst employment contract, written by someone who really hated their HR department. The oath transformed a free citizen into property, not metaphorically, legally. You became the property of your lanista, the owner of the Gladiator school, for the duration of your contract. You had just voluntarily signed away your freedom, your rights, and quite possibly your life. But hey, at least your creditors were happy. The fact that so many free citizens chose this path tells us something horrifying about late Republican Rome. This was a society where slavery and probable death seemed like a reasonable alternative to poverty, where the theoretical rights of citizenship had become so meaningless for the lower classes that they'd trade them for a chance at survival. It was capitalism with swords and significantly worse workplace safety standards. So you've taken one of our 3 exciting career paths, and now you're standing at the gates of a ludus, a gladiator school. Maybe you're in chains, maybe you're clutching your signing bonus and wondering if you've made a terrible mistake. Spoiler, you have. Either way, you're about to enter a world that makes military boot camp look like a spa retreat. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Imagine a gym that hasn't been cleaned since the founding of Rome. Add the aroma of hundreds of unwashed men living in close quarters, mix in the scent of blood, sweat, and fear, and you're getting close. The ludus isn't just a training facility. It's your new home, prison, and quite possibly your final resting place. At the center of this delightful establishment is the lanista, your new owner, manager, tormentor. The lanista is basically a pimp for violence, a businessman who deals in human flesh and bloodshed. Socially, he's considered about as reputable as an actual pimp, which is to say, not at all. He's infamous himself, but he's also potentially very rich. A successful lanista can make a fortune renting out his gladiators to wealthy Romans hosting games. His entire business model depends on turning you from whatever you were before into a profitable killing machine. The lanista looks at you the way a sculptor looks at a block of marble. If the sculptor was planning to rent out the statue to get repeatedly hit with hammers, you're an investment. And like any investment, you need to be developed, maintained, and eventually liquidated for profit. Your first stop is the medical examination. The ludus physician, who's probably better trained than any doctor you'd find treating regular Roman citizens, gives you a thorough once-over. This isn't out of concern for your well-being, it's quality control. A gladiator who drops dead during training is a wasted investment. The doctor checks your teeth, your muscles, your reflexes, and probably your will to live. That last one tends to deteriorate pretty quickly. Assuming you pass the physical, you're assigned a fighting style. This isn't based on what you want or what looks coolest. It's based on a cold calculation of your body type, natural abilities, and what the market demands. Tall and rangy, you might become a retiarius, fighting with a net and trident. Short and stocky, perhaps a murmillo, weighed down with heavy armor. The decision is made for you, like everything else in your new life. You're then assigned to a specific training group. Different gladiator types train separately. Can't have future opponents getting too familiar with each other's techniques. Your trainer is a doctor, not the medical kind. It's from the Latin for teacher. He's usually a retired gladiator, someone who somehow survived long enough to earn his freedom and decided the best use of that freedom was to train other poor bastards to go through the same hell he did. He's scarred, cynical, and has absolutely zero patience for your questions about motivation or finding your warrior spirit. Your new home is a cell, not a room, not quarters, a cell. Archaeological excavations of gladiator schools show tiny, cramped spaces, often barely large enough to lie down in. You might share this luxurious accommodation with one or two other gladiators, because nothing says rest and recovery like being packed in like sardines with other large, violent men who might someday have to kill you for the entertainment of strangers. The daily routine begins before dawn. You're awakened by the clanging of iron bars or the melodious shouting of guards. First comes breakfast, and I use that term loosely. Remember that barley porridge I mentioned? That's your new best friend. Gladiators were called hordearii, barley eaters, and for good reason. Your diet consists primarily of barley, beans, and whatever else is cheap and filling. But here's the thing. This wasn't neglect. This was strategy. The high-carbohydrate diet was specifically designed to pack on pounds, but not the lean muscle you might expect. No, they wanted you fat. A nice layer of subcutaneous fat served as armor for your internal organs. It meant you could take more superficial cuts without bleeding out, creating a bloodier, longer, more entertaining spectacle. You were literally being fattened up for the slaughter, like the world's most violent livestock. To counteract the calcium deficiency from this stellar diet, you drink a special tonic made from charred wood or bone ash. Imagine starting your day with a refreshing glass of burnt wood juice. Delicious. After choking down breakfast, it's time for training. You start with wooden weapons, a wooden sword called a rudis and a wicker shield. These practice weapons are deliberately made to be twice as heavy as real ones. The idea is that when you finally get to use actual weapons, they'll feel light and fast in your hands. It's clever in a we're preparing you to kill people more efficiently sort of way. You spend hours practicing against a wooden post called a palace. Thrust, parry, dodge, repeat, over and over until your muscles scream and your brain goes numb. The doctor walks among the trainees, correcting form with helpful comments like, "You call that a thrust? My grandmother stabs harder than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. Any mistake is met with a stick across the shoulders or worse." Sparring comes next, but always with wooden weapons. Real weapons are for the arena only. Can't have valuable property damaging other valuable property during practice. You're matched against other trainees, learning to read opponents, to spot weaknesses, to exploit openings. It's like a deadly dance class where forgetting the steps means a wooden sword to the face. The afternoon might bring specialized training. Retiare practice with their nets, learning to cast and entangle. Myrmiones work on their shield techniques. Esidari, chariot fighters, practice not falling off their chariots and looking somewhat dignified while trying to stab people from a moving platform. Each style has its own techniques, its own strategies, its own ways to die horribly in front of a crowd. Between training sessions, there's more eating, more barley, joy, medical treatment for injuries, and there are always injuries, and perhaps some basic equipment maintenance. You might also receive massage therapy, not for relaxation, but to keep your muscles functional. You're like a race car that bleeds, high maintenance, expensive, and expected to perform at peak efficiency right up until you crash and burn. As the sun sets, it's back to your cell. If you're lucky, you might get an hour or two to socialize with your fellow gladiators. This is where things get psychologically twisted. These men are your brothers in suffering, the only people who understand what you're going through. You form bonds, friendships, even something approaching family. Many gladiators formed burial societies, pooling resources to ensure they'd get a proper funeral when, not if, they died. But here's the mindfuck. Any one of these friends might be your opponent in the arena. The man you're sharing your evening meal with might be the one trying to put a sword through your chest next week. It's like being in the world's worst reality show where voting someone off involves actual murder. Security is tight. Really tight. The Romans hadn't forgotten the Spartacus rebellion, which started in a gladiator school in Capua. That little incident where a group of gladiators decided they'd rather not die for entertainment and proceeded to rampage across Italy for 2 years left a lasting impression. So you're not just locked in at night, you're often chained, because nothing says sweet dreams like iron shackles. Here's one of the great ironies of gladiatorial life. You probably received better medical care than 90% of Roman citizens. This wasn't because anyone gave a damn about your well-being as a human being. It was because you were expensive property, and broken property doesn't generate revenue. Think about it from the Lannista's perspective. He's invested serious money in you. Buying a slave, feeding them, housing them, training them, it all adds up. A well-trained gladiator could cost as much as a small house. You don't let an investment like that die from an infected training wound or a broken bone that could have been set properly. So gladiator schools employed the best physicians money could buy. These weren't your average Roman doctors who might prescribe prayers and pigeon droppings for a fever. These were serious medical professionals who understood anatomy, surgery, and trauma care at a level that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for centuries. The most famous of these gladiator physicians was Galen, who would later become the Roman Empire's most renowned medical writer. He spent 4 years as the chief physician at a gladiator school in Pergamon, and he used it as a kind of teaching hospital. Gladiators provided him with a steady stream of traumatic injuries to study and treat. He called wounds windows into the body, which is a poetic way of saying, I learned anatomy by looking at people's exposed organs. Galen boasted that under his care, only 2 gladiators died from their wounds, compared to 60 under his predecessor. He developed advanced surgical techniques, including suturing deep muscle layers and ligating severed arteries. He could remove arrows, reset compound fractures, and even perform successful abdominal surgery. All of this medical knowledge, gained from patching up gladiators, would influence European medicine for the next 1,000 years. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Gladiator cemeteries show numerous skeletons with well-healed traumatic injuries, broken bones that were properly set, skull fractures that the victim survived, even evidence of successful amputations. These men were put back together again and again, like violent jigsaw puzzles. But remember, this excellent medical care had nothing to do with compassion. You were being repaired the same way a blacksmith repairs a sword, so you could go back to work. The goal wasn't your long-term health, it was your short-term functionality. They needed you operational for the next games, the next spectacle, the next opportunity to bleed for the crowd's amusement. The medical care extended beyond just patching up wounds. Gladiators received regular checkups, dental care, can't have you dying from an abscessed tooth before your big match, and even dietary supplements. They were given special massages to keep their muscles supple and treatments for chronic conditions. It was comprehensive health care, centuries before such a thing existed for ordinary people. This created a deeply disturbing situation where gladiators were simultaneously the best cared for and most expendable people in Rome. You'd receive world-class medical treatment for your training injuries, only to be sent into the arena to receive new ones. It was like having excellent health insurance that only covered injuries sustained while people were trying to kill you for sport. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of gladiator life wasn't the physical brutality or the constant threat of death. It was the psychological torture of the relationships you formed. The ludus forced men into an artificial family, the familia gladiatoria, bound together by shared suffering, common purpose, and the knowledge that any one of them might have to kill another for the amusement of strangers. Imagine this. You're thrown into this nightmare with a bunch of other unfortunate souls. You train together, eat together, bleed together. You share the same fears, the same pains, the same slim hopes of survival. Naturally, you form bonds. It's human nature. Even in the most inhuman conditions, people connect. You learn about each other's lives before the ludus. The Thracian in the cell next to yours tells you about his wife and children, sold into slavery when he was captured. The German across the training yard shows you a small carved wooden horse he made for his son, a son he'll never see again. The young Roman volunteer, drowning in debt, talks about his elderly parents who think he's found work as a merchant guard. These aren't just fellow gladiators. They become your brothers. When someone takes a bad hit in training, you're the one who helps carry him to the physician. When someone's having a bad day, and in a gladiator school, every day is a bad day, just varying degrees of awful, you're there with a word of encouragement or at least companionable silence. The gladiators even formalized these relationships. They created collegia, associations that were part union, part burial society, part support group. Members would contribute what little money they had to ensure that when someone died, they'd get a proper burial instead of being dumped in a mass grave. They'd make sure any family members received what compensation they could manage. These organizations had elected officials, rules, and even their own religious ceremonies. But here's where the sick genius of the system reveals itself. All these bonds, all this brotherhood, existed under the constant shadow of potential betrayal. Not betrayal in the personal sense, but the professional requirement that you might have to kill your friend for public entertainment. The matchmakers who arranged the games didn't care about your personal relationships. If anything, putting friends against each other probably added extra drama. The crowd loved a good story, and what's a better story than two brothers in arms forced to fight to the death? So you lived in this constant state of cognitive dissonance. The man teaching you a new defensive technique might be the one you'd need to use it against. The friend who shared his wine ration with you last night might be pointing a sword at your throat tomorrow. Every relationship existed with an asterisk, until we're matched against each other. Some gladiators tried to cope by maintaining emotional distance, but that was nearly impossible when you're living in such close quarters under such extreme conditions. Others made pacts, promises to make it quick if they ever faced each other, to aim for a clean kill rather than a lingering death. Imagine having that conversation. Hey, if we ever have to fight, try to stab me in the heart, not the gut. I'd do the same for you. The psychological impact of this was devastating. Modern soldiers who experience combat stress at least know that their unit has their back, that their brothers in arms are on their side. Gladiators had to live with the knowledge that their brothers in arms might literally be the death of them, and not through betrayal or cowardice, but through the simple bad luck of being scheduled against each other. This emotional torture was compounded by the public nature of gladiatorial death. If you killed a friend in the arena, you didn't do it in the chaos of battle, where you could tell yourself it was kill or be killed. You did it in front of thousands of cheering spectators, in a ritualized combat where every move was watched and judged. You had to perform the death of your friend as entertainment. Some gladiators cracked under this pressure. There are accounts of fighters who simply refused to engage when matched against close friends, standing in the arena and accepting death rather than fighting. Others went through with it but were psychologically destroyed afterward. Imagine having to return to the ludus after killing your best friend, to sleep in the same barracks, to see his empty cell, to face the other men who knew you both. The Romans, of course, saw this as part of the entertainment. The emotional drama, the visible anguish, the human tragedy, it all added to the spectacle. Your psychological torture was just another form of amusement for the crowd. Your broken friendships were as much a part of the show as your broken bodies. Let's talk money, because at the end of the day, that's what you were to the ludus, a financial asset with legs. Understanding the economics of gladiatorial life is crucial to understanding just how thoroughly trapped your situation was. A trained gladiator was expensive, really expensive. The exact costs varied by time period and location, but a skilled fighter could cost as much as a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. Some top-tier gladiators sold for prices equivalent to what you'd pay for a small farm or a modest house in the city. This might sound like it would work in your favor. After all, nobody wants to carelessly destroy expensive property. But in reality, it made your life worse in ways you probably couldn't imagine when you first entered the ludus. First, let's understand the business model. The lanista made money by renting you out to wealthy Romans hosting games. These editors, the people sponsoring the games, would pay for gladiators the way modern event planners rent equipment. Except the equipment could die and death actually cost extra. If you died in the arena, the editor had to compensate your lanista for the loss. This payment, called the compensation for the slain, could be substantial, sometimes 5 or 10 times the rental fee. This created a perverse incentive structure where your death could actually be more profitable than your life, especially if you were getting old, injured, or less popular with the crowds. Think about that for a second. Your owner could make more money from your death than from keeping you alive. It's like having life insurance, where the beneficiary is also the person who decides whether you need to juggle chainsaws for a living. This economic reality influenced everything about your life. Your training was designed not to make you the best fighter possible, but to make you the most profitable fighter possible. This meant learning to fight in a way that was visually exciting, that prolonged matches, that created drama. A quick, efficient kill might be good military tactics, but it was bad entertainment. You were trained to make the fight last, to create near misses and dramatic reversals, to bleed impressively, but not fatally. Your diet, as we discussed, was calculated to make you fat enough to take multiple wounds without dying immediately. Your medical care was designed to get you back in the arena as quickly as possible, not to ensure your long-term health. Every aspect of your existence was optimized for one thing: generating the maximum return on investment before you inevitably died. If you were a volunteer gladiator and auctoratus, you had some ability to negotiate your contract. But negotiate is a strong word when one party is desperate enough to sign up for probable death. The signing bonus you received, the money that probably drove you to this insane decision in the first place, was often structured as a loan against future earnings. Miss too many fights due to injury? Your debt increased. Become unpopular with the crowds? Your value decreased, but your obligations didn't. Some successful gladiators could earn prize money from victories, gifts from admirers, and bonuses from particularly impressive performances. A few became genuinely wealthy, but remember, you were infamous. You couldn't legally own property in many cases. Your money might be held in trust by your lanista, who charged management fees that would make modern hedge fund managers blush. Even if you somehow accumulated wealth, what could you do with it? You couldn't buy your way into respectable society. You couldn't hold public office or engage in many legitimate businesses. Your money was as tainted as you were, useful only for temporary pleasures or for bribing your way to slightly better treatment. The real kicker came if you survived long enough to earn your freedom. That wooden sword, the rudis that symbolized your release from combat, didn't come with a pension plan. You were free, but you were also unemployed, socially ostracized, and possessed of a skill set that was basically useless outside the arena. Many freed gladiators ended up working as trainers, bodyguards, or even returning to fight as free men because it was the only way they knew to make a living. The economics of being a gladiator created a perfect trap. The system was designed to extract maximum value from your body while giving you just enough hope to keep you compliant. You were simultaneously too valuable to waste carelessly and too expendable to treat as human. You existed in the sweet spot of exploitation where your suffering was profitable and your death was just another business transaction. Now let's dive deep into what daily training actually meant, because it wasn't just physically brutal. It was scientifically designed to transform you from whatever you were before into a very specific type of killer. Not a soldier, not a warrior, but an entertainer who killed. The wooden sword you trained with, the rudis, weighed twice as much as a real gladius. This wasn't just casual sadism, though there was plenty of that. It was methodology borrowed from the Roman legions. When you finally held a real sword, it would feel impossibly light and fast. Your muscles, accustomed to the heavier practice weapon, would have explosive power. It's like training for a marathon while wearing a weighted vest, except the marathon involves stabbing people. Your target was the polis, a wooden post about half the height of a man. You'd spend hours attacking this thing, practicing the same movements over and over until they became automatic. Thrust to the throat, cut to the leg, parry an imaginary attack, reset, repeat. The doctor would watch, correcting your form with helpful encouragement like a stick to the kidneys. But here's what made gladiator training different from military training. You weren't learning to kill efficiently. You were learning to kill entertainingly. A Roman soldier was taught to kill quickly and move on to the next enemy. A gladiator was taught to make it last, to create drama, to turn death into theater. This meant learning not just how to attack, but how to attack in ways that looked good to spectators 50 rows back. Your movements had to be large, visible, dramatic. A subtle feint that would work in real combat was useless if the crowd couldn't see it. You learned to telegraph your moves just enough to build suspense, to create those heart-stopping moments where the audience gasped, thinking you were about to die, only to dodge at the last second. You also learned to bleed properly. Yes, there was a right and wrong way to bleed in the arena. Shallow cuts that produced lots of blood but minimal damage were preferable to deep wounds that might end the fight too quickly. You learned where to cut an opponent to create the most visual impact with the least risk of immediate death. It was makeup artistry with swords. Different gladiator types had completely different training regimens. If you were a retiarius, you spent hours learning to cast your net. This wasn't just throwing a weighted net. It was an art form. You had to judge distance, predict movement, and create opportunities. You practiced entangling wooden posts, moving targets, and eventually other trainees. You learned to use your trident not just as a spear, but as a tool to control distance, to keep heavily armored opponents at bay while looking for the perfect moment to cast your net. If you were a Murmillo or Secutor, your training focused on endurance. Wearing up to 40 pounds of armor in the Italian sun while fighting for your life required incredible conditioning. You'd train in full gear, learning to manage the weight, to move efficiently despite the restrictions. You practiced specific techniques for fighting against more mobile opponents, ways to use your superior protection to create advantages. The psychological training was just as intense as the physical. You had to learn to perform under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The trainers would simulate crowd noise, having other gladiators shout and jeer while you fought. They'd create distractions, sudden noises, anything to prepare you for the chaos of the arena. You also had to learn to read the crowd. A gladiator who couldn't work the audience didn't last long. You learned when to showboat, when to play up an injury for sympathy, when to be aggressive to get the crowd on your side. It was method acting where bad reviews meant death. Some gladiators specialized in fighting animals, venatores, or in execution spectacles. Their training was even more specialized and arguably more horrifying. Imagine learning to make a condemned criminal's death last long enough to satisfy the crowd, but not so long that they got bored. Or practicing how to fight a bear in a way that looked heroic rather than like the desperate flailing it actually was. Injuries during training were common and expected. Broken bones, torn muscles, concussions, all part of the learning process. The medical staff would patch you up and send you back out as soon as possible. There was no concept of recovery time or taking it easy. If you could stand, you could train. If you could hold a sword, you could fight. The mental toll of this training was enormous. You were being programmed, day after day, to accept violence as performance, death as entertainment. The constant repetition, the brutal discipline, the knowledge of what you were training for, it broke men down psychologically as surely as physically. Some gladiators found a kind of zen in the training, losing themselves in the repetition and discipline. Others went mad from it. The suicide rate in gladiator schools was high enough that special precautions were taken. Weapons were locked away when not in use. Gladiators were watched for signs of despair, not out of compassion, but because a gladiator who killed himself was a total loss of investment. After months or years of training, the day would finally come. You'd be selected for the games. All that practice, all that conditioning, all that carefully choreographed violence, it was time to put it to use. But first, let's understand what the games actually meant, because it wasn't just two guys fighting. It was a massive production that would put modern entertainment events to shame. A full day of games, properly called munus, which ironically means duty or gift, followed a very specific schedule designed to take the audience on an emotional journey. Think of it as a 3-act play where each act featured different kinds of death. The days started with animal spectacles. Exotic beasts from across the empire, lions from Africa, bears from Germania, crocodiles from Egypt, were brought into the arena. This wasn't just random animal slaughter, though there was plenty of that. It was a carefully choreographed display of Roman dominance over nature. Professional beast hunters called venatores would fight these animals in elaborate staged hunts. Sets were built to look like forests or mountains. Sometimes they'd flood the arena and stage naval battles with crocodiles. It was like a nature documentary directed by someone with unlimited resources and zero ethical concerns. Lunchtime entertainment consisted of executing condemned criminals in creative ways. This is where the Noxi, criminals sentenced to death, met their ends. But the Romans didn't do simple executions. They turned them into mythological reenactments. A criminal might be dressed as Icarus and thrown from a great height. Another might play Hercules and be burned alive. One particularly creative execution involved dressing a condemned man as Orpheus and having him torn apart by animals, just like in the myth. It was dinner theater where the actors actually died. This was what everyone came for: the gladiator fights. Your moment had arrived. The afternoon would begin with a pompa, a grand procession. Musicians, dancers, priests carrying images of the gods, and finally the gladiators themselves would parade around the arena. You'd march in wearing your best armor, polished and gleaming, trying to look confident while your insides turned to water. The crowd would be massive. The Colosseum held 50,000 people, and smaller amphitheaters across the empire held proportionally huge crowds. The noise would be deafening. Vendors selling snacks, people placing bets, drunk spectators already shouting for blood. And somewhere in the special seats, the editor who sponsored the games would be watching, calculating whether his investment in spectacle would pay off in political support. Before the real fights, there might be prolusiu, mock combats with wooden weapons to warm up the crowd. Think of it as an opening act, except the opening act might have to die later if the main show needed extra bodies. Then came the moment of truth. You'd be paired against another gladiator, usually of a different fighting style, to create an interesting matchup. A retiarius against a secutor. A thrax against a myrmio. Each pairing was designed to create a specific type of drama. Speed versus strength, defense versus offense, reach versus protection. A referee, usually a retired gladiator, would oversee the match. Yes, there were rules. No hitting a man when he was down without permission. No attacks to the back. Try to make it look good for the crowd. The referee carried a long stick and wouldn't hesitate to use it if you weren't putting on enough of a show. And here's where all that training came into play. You weren't just fighting, you were performing. Every move had to be visible to the furthest seats. Every near miss had to look convincing. You had to pace the fight, creating moments of tension and release. Too quick and the crowd would be disappointed. Too long and they'd get bored. Both were potentially fatal mistakes. The psychological pressure was beyond description. 50,000 people watching your every move, screaming for blood, preferably yours. The editor judging whether you were worth the rental fee. Your lanista calculating profit and loss. And opposite you, another human being who you had to either kill or be killed by, all while making it look entertaining. Some gladiators thrived under this pressure, becoming genuine stars. They learned to work the crowd, to play characters. The retiarius might play up his agility, taunting his heavier opponent. The myrmio might project stoic determination. It was professional wrestling, except the outcomes weren't predetermined and the losers actually died. The fight would continue until one gladiator was killed, two injured to continue, or surrendered. Surrender was done by dropping your shield and raising a finger, the ad digitum. This put your fate in the hands of the editor, who would usually be influenced by the crowd's reaction. And here's where one of history's great misconceptions comes in. The whole thumbs up, thumbs down thing is probably backwards. Scholars now believe that a thumb pressed against the closed fist, like a sheathed sword, meant mercy, while a raised thumb, like a drawn sword, meant death. But whatever the gesture, the meaning was clear. Your life now depended on how well you'd entertained. If you won, you'd receive a palm branch and possibly prize money. If you lost but were granted missio, mercy, you'd live to fight another day. If you lost and were denied mercy, well, at least it would be quick. The victor was expected to deliver a swift, clean death blow, usually to the throat or heart. It was the last bit of professionalism in a professional's career. But winning wasn't necessarily better than losing with mercy. Now you had to walk back to the ludus past the body of someone you just killed. Someone who, just minutes ago, was a living, breathing person with hopes and fears, and maybe a family somewhere wondering if they'd ever see him again. And you'd made him into entertainment. The trauma of this experience cannot be overstated. Modern soldiers who kill in combat often suffer severe psychological consequences, and they at least have the justification of defending their country or their comrades. Gladiators killed for applause. They turned human death into a performance art. The psychological damage was incalculable. Some gladiators became addicted to it. The adrenaline, the crowd's adoration, the moment of victory. Others were destroyed by it, becoming hollow shells going through the motions until their luck ran out. Many turned to alcohol or other forms of self-medication to cope with what they'd done and seen. And remember, this wasn't a one-time thing. If you survived, you'd be back in the arena again and again and again. Each victory increased your fame, but also your psychological burden. Each fight was another roll of the dice with your life as the stake. The mathematics of survival were brutal. Even if you had a 90% chance of surviving each individual fight, those odds compounded. Fight 10 times, and your chances of surviving all of them drop to about 35%. Fight 20 times, and you're looking at about a 12% survival rate. The arena was patient. It would get you eventually. This is what you trained for. This is what your life led to. Not glory, not heroism, but a desperate struggle to stay alive, while making your potential death entertaining enough that the crowd might let you live if you failed. It was existence reduced to its most brutal economics. Kill or die, and make it look good either way. So far, we've been talking about gladiators as if they were all the same. But that's like saying all pizza is the same. Sure, it's all technically pizza, but there's a world of difference between a gourmet wood-fired margarita and whatever Pizza Hut thinks it's doing. Similarly, the world of gladiatorial combat was incredibly diverse, with each type presenting a different flavor of potential death. Let's start with the classic matchups, because the Romans didn't just throw random fighters together. They were connoisseurs of violence, and they wanted their bloodshed properly paired like wine with cheese. The most iconic pairing was the retiarius versus the secutor. The retiarius was basically an underwater nightmare brought to land, nearly naked except for a shoulder guard, fighting with a weighted net, a trident, and a dagger. No helmet, minimal armor, just speed, agility, and the world's deadliest fishing equipment. The name literally means netman, which sounds about as intimidating as accountant, until you realize this accountant is trying to tangle you up and stab you with a 3-pronged spear. Facing the retiarius was the secutor, whose name means pursuer, and boy did he live up to it. Covered in heavy armor with a distinctive smooth helmet designed so the net couldn't catch on anything, carrying a large shield and a short sword, the secutor was like a medieval tank. But tanks aren't known for their speed, and neither was the secutor. The helmet, while great for net deflection, had tiny eye holes that severely limited vision and made breathing about as easy as trying to suck air through a coffee stirrer. This created a perfect drama. Speed versus power, agility versus armor, reach versus protection. The retiarius would dance around, trying to net his opponent or keep him at trident length. The secutor would pursue relentlessly, trying to close the distance where his sword and shield would dominate. It was like watching a bullfight if the bull had armor and the matador forgot most of his clothes. Then there was the Murmillo, identifiable by his distinctive fish-shaped helmet crest, because apparently the Romans thought what this deathmatch needs is more seafood themes. He carried a large rectangular shield and a straight sword, fighting in a style reminiscent of Roman legionaries. The Murmillo often faced the Thrax, who wielded a curved sword and a small square shield, fighting in a style that supposedly represented Rome's Thracian enemies. The Hoplomachus brought Greek fighting styles to the arena, with a small round shield and a spear. When matched against a Murmillo, it became a contest between Roman and Greek military traditions, because nothing says cultural exchange forcing representatives of different martial traditions to murder each other for entertainment. There were even mounted gladiators called equites, who began their fights on horseback with lances, then dismounted to continue with swords. Imagine trying to look dignified while climbing off a horse in full armor, knowing that the guy you're about to fight is in the exact same awkward position. It was like the world's deadliest equestrian event. Some specialized types pushed the boundaries of what could be considered gladiatorial combat. The Esidarii fought from chariots, because apparently regular gladiatorial combat wasn't dangerous enough without adding the possibility of being trampled by your own horses. The Dimachari wielded 2 swords and no shield, presumably because they looked at regular gladiators and thought, you know what this needs? Less defense and more opportunities to accidentally stab myself. But wait, it gets weirder. The Andabata fought blindfolded. Yes, you read that correctly. Blindfolded. With real weapons. It was like a lethal piñata party, where the piñatas hit back. This wasn't considered a prestigious type of gladiator. It was more like comic relief. If your idea of comedy involves watching blindfolded people try to murder each other. Each type required different training, different tactics, and different ways to die horribly. If you were assigned to be a retiarius, you'd spend months learning to cast a net accurately while someone was trying to stab you. If you were a secutor, you'd train to fight while essentially looking through a mail slot and breathing through a straw. Every style had its advantages and its potentially fatal disadvantages. The pairings were carefully calculated to create maximum drama. You never saw retiarius versus retiarius. 2 guys with nets just tangling each other up wasn't entertaining. Similarly, secutor versus secutor would just be 2 heavily armored men slowly beating each other senseless. The Romans wanted contrast, conflict, a narrative they could follow. This specialization meant that gladiators became very, very good at their specific style. A veteran retiarius knew exactly how much his net weighed, exactly how far he could cast it, exactly how to use his trident to control distance. A experienced Murmillo could use his shield like an extension of his body, creating an almost impenetrable defense. But this specialization also created a horrible kind of Russian roulette. Your survival often depended less on your individual skill and more on the matchup. A retiarius might dominate 9 fights against secutores, then face a particularly fast one and die. A Murmillo might handle Thraces all day, then get matched against a Hoplomachus whose spear work he couldn't counter. You had no say in these matchups. The editor and lanista would decide based on what would create the best show, not what gave you the best chance of survival. You might have spent years perfecting your technique against one type of opponent, only to be thrown against something completely different because the crowd was getting bored of the usual pairings. And remember, you couldn't just switch styles if yours wasn't working out. You were trained for one specific type of combat. A retiarius couldn't suddenly decide he'd rather have armor. A secutor couldn't choose to ditch his helmet for better vision. You were locked into your role, for better or worse, until death or freedom released you from it. If you thought being a male gladiator was a raw deal, let me introduce you to the gladiatrix. Female gladiators who managed to find an even more spectacular way to hit rock bottom in Roman society. These women didn't just face the usual gladiatorial challenges of probably dying for entertainment. They added a spectacular layer of social scandal that made regular gladiators look positively respectable by comparison. The existence of female gladiators is one of those historical facts that makes academics really excited and everyone else really uncomfortable. We have solid evidence they existed. Literary references, legal documents, even a carved relief from Halicarnassus showing two female gladiators named Amazon and Achillea, because of course they had stage names, fighting each other. But here's the thing. If male gladiators were already infamous, female gladiators were basically off the social charts entirely. Roman society had very specific ideas about what women should do: weave, have babies, stay quiet, and what they definitely shouldn't do: fight in public while wearing very little clothing. Female gladiators didn't just cross that line, they pole vaulted over it while setting it on fire. The Roman reaction to gladiatrices was a fascinating mix of titillation and moral outrage. The same crowds that cheered for them also condemned them. Writers like Juvenal practically had aneurysms writing about them, describing female gladiators as symptoms of a diseased society. He particularly enjoyed mocking upper-class women who trained as gladiators, writing about how they grunted unattractively while practicing and how ridiculous they looked in armor. And yes, you read that right. Some upper-class women actually chose to become gladiators. While most female gladiators were likely slaves or desperate poor women, there are records of women from senatorial and equestrian families entering the arena. This was such a scandal that the Senate actually passed laws specifically forbidding women of high social standing from fighting as gladiators. When your hobby is so controversial it requires specific legislation, you know you've really pushed some boundaries. The motivation for these upper-class women remains a historical mystery that makes academics fight each other at conferences. Was it rebellion against social constraints? A desire for the fame and adulation that successful gladiators received? Some really extreme method of getting daddy's attention? We don't know, but whatever drove them to it, they were willing to accept a level of social disgrace that made regular infamia look mild. Female gladiators fought using the same equipment and styles as men. They weren't given special lady gladiator equipment or easier opponents. The relief from Halicarnassus shows them using standard gladiatorial gear, suggesting they were trained and fought just like their male counterparts. Well, almost like their male counterparts. They apparently fought with their breasts exposed, because the Romans couldn't let an opportunity for sexualization pass by. This created a bizarre situation where female gladiators were simultaneously objects of desire and disgust. They were exotic, titillating entertainment, but also walking violations of everything Roman women were supposed to be. Men might fantasize about them, but would never marry them. They were the ultimate bad girls in a society that really didn't like bad girls. The practical challenges for female gladiators were enormous. Beyond the usual trying not to die issues, they faced unique problems. Training facilities were designed for men. Equipment was sized for men. The entire gladiatorial system was built around male bodies and male social roles. Female gladiators had to navigate all of this while also dealing with the additional shame and stigma of being women in a male space. Some emperors loved female gladiators. Nero and Domitian both staged games featuring women, using them as a way to show how lavish and unusual their entertainments were. "Look," these games said, "I'm so wealthy and powerful I can make women fight for your amusement." It was conspicuous consumption with human lives. But even in the arena, female gladiators faced discrimination. They were often scheduled for novelty matches rather than serious combats. They might fight other women, or they might be matched against dwarfs or animals in fights designed more for comedy than genuine competition. It was degradation piled on top of degradation. The ban on upper-class women becoming gladiators tells us something important. The practice was common enough to require legislation. This wasn't a one-time thing that happened once and shocked everyone. Enough noble women were entering the arena that the Senate felt compelled to act. The law was expanded under Septimius Severus to include all freeborn women under the age of 20, suggesting the problem was growing. For lower-class women and slaves who became gladiatresses, the motivations were probably similar to their male counterparts: desperation, coercion, or the slim hope of earning enough to buy their freedom. But they faced additional vulnerabilities. A female slave had value beyond the arena as a domestic servant, a concubine, or in other roles. Sending her to fight as a gladiator was often a form of punishment or a last resort when she'd proven too troublesome for other uses. The sexual dynamics added another layer of horror to an already horrible situation. Female gladiators were objects of sexual fascination, and we can only imagine the additional abuses they faced in the ludus and from spectators. They were already property, already infamous, already condemned to fight for others' amusement. The addition of sexual exploitation was just one more form of degradation in a life already full of them. Female gladiators eventually disappeared from the arena, banned entirely by Septimius Severus in 200 AD. But for about 2 centuries, they represented the absolute extreme of what the arena could do to a person. They were women who, by choice or circumstance, entered a world that stripped them of every protection and dignity Roman society offered to their gender. They became warriors in a culture that despised warrior women, celebrities in a world that condemned them, fighters in an arena that saw them as little more than an exotic sideshow. Their existence reminds us that the arena wasn't just about blood and death. It was about pushing boundaries, violating norms, and creating spectacles that shocked even as they entertained. Female gladiators were the ultimate expression of this. Human beings transformed into something that shouldn't exist, fighting for the amusement of crowds who watched them with a mixture of lust, disgust, and fascination. As if fighting other humans wasn't bad enough, the Romans decided the arena needed more variety. Enter the Venatores and Bestiari, the beast fighters who proved that yes, things could actually get worse than regular gladiatorial combat. Let's start with an important distinction. Venatores were professional beast hunters, trained specialists who fought animals as a career. They had their own training school in Rome, the Ludus Matutinus, the morning school, because beast hunts happened in the morning. These guys were the Steve Irwins of the ancient world, if Steve Irwin had been forced to kill the animals for public entertainment. Bestiari, on the other hand, were usually condemned criminals sentenced to damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution with extra steps and a lot more teeth. They were given minimal or no weapons and thrown to hungry predators. It was the lunch special at the games, and they were the lunch. The Venatores had it marginally better than the Bestiari. in the same way that having your arm cut off is marginally better than having your head cut off. They were trained, equipped, and had a fighting chance against their opponents. They used spears, bows, daggers, and sometimes even elaborate mechanical devices to fight creatures from across the empire. The logistics of these beast hunts were staggering. The Romans imported animals from every corner of their territory and beyond. Lions from Africa, bears from Germania, tigers from India, crocodiles from Egypt. If it had teeth, claws, or a bad attitude, the Romans wanted it in their arena. Entire trade networks developed just to supply the games with exotic animals. Ships designed specifically for transporting dangerous animals crossed the Mediterranean, their holds full of caged nightmares. The numbers were insane. During the inaugural games of the Colosseum, 9,000 animals were killed. In one set of games under Trajan, 11,000 animals died over 123 days. The Romans were so efficient at this slaughter that they drove several species to regional extinction. North African elephants? Gone. Lions in Mesopotamia? Wiped out. European aurochs? Hunted to extinction partly to fuel the games. For the Venators, each animal presented unique challenges. A lion was straightforward. It wanted to kill you. You wanted to kill it. May the best mammal win. But a bear? Bears were smart, unpredictable, and absolutely did not want to be there. They might charge, they might flee, they might decide to climb the arena walls and try to eat the spectators, which occasionally happened, much to everyone's excitement and terror. Crocodiles required the arena to be flooded, turning the whole thing into an aquatic horror show. Elephants were particularly problematic. They were intelligent enough to understand what was happening and strong enough to do something about it. There are records of elephants refusing to fight, kneeling before the crowd in what observers interpreted as pleas for mercy. The crowd usually demanded their death anyway, because mercy was not a Roman virtue. The spectacle wasn't just about killing animals. Elaborate sets were constructed to create artificial environments. They'd build fake forests, mountains, even lakes in the arena. It was like a nature documentary, directed by a psychopath. Animals would be released into these environments, and Venatores would hunt them down while the crowd watched. Sometimes they'd get creative. Really creative. They'd chain different animals together to force them to fight. They'd drug animals to make them more aggressive. They'd starve predators for days before releasing them into the arena with convicted criminals. It was systematic animal cruelty elevated to an art form. For the bestiari, the condemned criminals, facing the beasts was pure horror. Unlike gladiatorial combat, where skill might save you, being thrown to the animals was designed to be hopeless. You might be given a wooden sword, more as a cruel joke than an actual weapon. Sometimes they'd give you nothing at all, just to see how long you could run before the inevitable. The psychological torture started before the physical attack. Imagine being held in a cell, hearing the roars and screams from the arena, knowing your turn was coming. When they finally dragged you out, the sun would blind you. The crowd's roar would deafen you, and then you'd see it, whatever nightmare they'd chosen for your execution. The Romans, never missing an opportunity for theater, often turned these executions into mythological reenactments. A criminal might be dressed as Orpheus and torn apart by bears. Another might play Prometheus, chained to a rock while an eagle, or more likely a very confused vulture, pecked at them. It was community theater where the actors actually died. For the professional Venators who survived their careers, the physical toll was enormous. Scars were universal: claw marks, bite wounds, horn punctures. Many walked with limps from injuries that never properly healed. But the psychological damage might have been worse. These men spent their careers killing magnificent creatures for entertainment, turning nature's predators into props for Roman amusement. Some Venators became celebrities, known for particular skills or spectacular kills. Carpophorus was famous for killing 20 wild beasts in a single session, including a bear, a lion, and a leopard. The crowd loved him, but what did he see when he closed his eyes at night? How many roaring faces haunted his dreams? The beast hunts served a political purpose beyond entertainment. They demonstrated Rome's dominion over nature itself. Every exotic animal dragged into the arena was proof of the empire's reach. Every beast killed was a symbolic victory over the wild, uncivilized world beyond Rome's borders. The message was clear. Rome could take anything from anywhere and destroy it for fun. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the beast fights was their sheer waste. Thousands upon thousands of animals, many of them rare or magnificent, killed for no purpose beyond momentary entertainment. Entire ecosystems disrupted, species driven to extinction, all to give bored Romans something to watch between breakfast and the real gladiator fights. The Venatores and Bestiari represented two extremes of the arena's cruelty. One group turned animal killing into a profession. The other had animal killing turned into their execution. Both served the same ultimate purpose, reminding everyone watching that in Rome, everything, human, animal, or anything in between, existed only at the pleasure of the crowd and the whim of the emperor. Let's talk about money again, because in Rome, like everywhere else, if you want to understand why something horrible kept happening, you follow the cash. The gladiatorial games weren't just entertainment. They were big business, a massive industry that employed thousands and moved fortunes. And like any industry built on human misery, the profits flowed upward while the blood flowed down. At the top of this economic pyramid sat the editors, the sponsors of the games. These were usually politicians, from local magistrates trying to win votes to emperors demonstrating their magnificence. For them, sponsoring games was an investment in political capital. The math was simple. Spectacular games meant popular support. Popular support meant political power. Political power meant access to even more wealth. It was campaign financing with corpses. The cost of putting on games was staggering. Renting gladiators, transporting animals, building temporary amphitheaters in cities without permanent ones, hiring musicians, referees, and support staff. It all added up. A modest provincial games might cost as much as a comfortable Roman would earn in a lifetime. Imperial games in Rome could cost millions of sesterces, enough to fund a small war. But for ambitious politicians, it was worth every penny. Julius Caesar, while still climbing the political ladder, went deeply into debt to stage lavish games. He understood that in Rome, you didn't win hearts and minds with policy proposals, you won them with blood and spectacle. His games featured 320 pairs of gladiators in silver armor, a display of wealth so ostentatious, it actually worried his political opponents. They tried to pass laws limiting the number of gladiators that could appear in any single games, not out of concern for the gladiators, but because they recognized the political power such spectacles granted. The Lanistae occupied the middle tier of this economy. They were the wholesalers of violence, maintaining stables of gladiators, like particularly deadly livestock. A successful Lanista could become very wealthy, but the business was risky. Gladiators were expensive to maintain: food, training, medical care, security, and they had an unfortunate tendency to die, taking your investment with them. The pricing structure was revealing. Renting a gladiator for a fight might cost, say, 1,000 sesterces. But if that gladiator died, the editor had to pay compensation. sometimes 15,000 to 20,000 sesterces for a trained fighter. This created perverse incentives. A lanista might make more from a gladiator's death than from years of rentals. Suddenly, that aging fighter who wasn't drawing crowds anymore looked more valuable dead than alive. Some lanistae operated on massive scales. The imperial ludus in Rome could house thousands of gladiators. These weren't just training schools, but vertically integrated businesses. They employed trainers, doctors, armor makers, weaponsmiths, even funeral directors, because someone had to handle all those bodies. The larger schools had their own farms to produce food, their own workshops to create equipment, their own networks for acquiring new recruits. The trade in gladiators themselves was another layer of the economy. Slave markets had special sections for potential gladiators. Dealers would travel to battlefields, buying prisoners of war in bulk. They'd assess physical condition, temperament, and potential fighting style with the cold efficiency of horse traders. A young, strong Gallic warrior might fetch a premium price, and an older, wounded prisoner might be bought cheap. A gamble that he could be trained into something profitable before his body gave out. There was even a futures market of sorts. Promising young gladiators might be bought and sold multiple times as their value increased with training and victories. A lanista might invest in a raw recruit, train him for a year, then sell him to a larger school for profit. It was venture capitalism with human assets. The support industries were enormous. Armor makers specialized in gladiatorial equipment, creating helmets, shields, and weapons to exacting specifications. Different gladiator types required different gear, all of it needing regular repair and replacement. A single gladiator's full equipment might cost as much as a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. Medical professionals found lucrative employment in the gladiator trade. Physicians who specialized in trauma surgery could command high fees from ludus owners. Some, like Galen, used their experience treating gladiators to advance medical knowledge, turning torn flesh into academic careers. Even death was profitable. Gladiator blood was sold as medicine. People believed it could cure epilepsy. Their body parts were turned into amulets. Rich women bought gladiator sweat as an aphrodisiac, creating possibly history's most disgusting beauty product. The bodies themselves, if unclaimed, might be sold to medical schools for dissection. Every part of a gladiator could be monetized. The betting economy around gladiatorial games was massive. Romans loved gambling, and the games provided endless opportunities. You could bet on winners, on how long fights would last, on whether mercy would be granted. Professional odds makers studied gladiators' records, fighting styles, and recent performances. Inside information about injuries or a gladiator's mental state could be worth fortunes. The games also drove ancillary spending. Vendors sold food, drinks, and souvenirs. Cushion renters made money providing slightly less uncomfortable seating. Prostitutes worked the crowds. Pickpockets had field days. The economic ripple effects of a major games could boost a city's economy for weeks. But let's not forget who paid the ultimate price for all this economic activity. At the bottom of the pyramid were the gladiators themselves, generating vast wealth while receiving almost none of it. A successful gladiator might earn prize money, gifts from admirers, and bonuses from grateful lanistae. But remember, many gladiators couldn't legally own property. Their earnings might be held in trust by their masters, subject to whatever fees and deductions the lanista felt like imposing. Even volunteer gladiators, who theoretically had more rights, found themselves trapped in exploitative contracts. That signing bonus that seemed so generous when you were desperate, it was probably structured as a loan against future earnings. with interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. Miss fights due to injury, your debt increased. Become unpopular with crowds, your value decreased, but your obligations didn't. The gladiator schools themselves operated on a kind of twisted credit system. Everything provided to a gladiator, food, equipment, medical care, was recorded as debt. Even if you were a slave who had no choice in being there, you were accumulating obligations to your master. This debt could be used to extend contracts, deny freedom, or extract even more labor from fighters who thought they were close to earning their release. The economics of the games created a self-perpetuating cycle. Politicians needed games to maintain power. Games required gladiators. Gladiators required a constant supply of new bodies as the old ones died or were freed. This demand drove slave raids, encouraged harsher criminal sentences, and pushed more desperate free men into the arena. The beast hunts drove entire species to extinction, while creating international trade networks dedicated to capturing and transporting animals to their deaths. It was an economy of death, dressed up as entertainment and justified as tradition. Fortunes were made, political careers launched, medical knowledge advanced, and international trade routes established, all built on a foundation of systematic human suffering. The gladiator games weren't just brutal, they were profitable. And in Rome, as in so many places throughout history, profit justified almost anything. After years of bleeding for the crowd's amusement, after dozens or even hundreds of fights, after watching friends die and killing strangers for sport, a gladiator might achieve the ultimate prize, the rudis, a wooden sword that symbolized freedom from the arena. It was the same type of practice sword you trained with, but in this context, it meant you never had to pick up a real one again. Unless, of course, you wanted to, which, horrifyingly, many did. The ceremony of manumission was public and dramatic, because the Romans never missed an opportunity for theater. After a particularly impressive victory or long service, the editor might call the gladiator to the center of the arena. The crowd would roar its approval, or occasionally its dissent. Some popular gladiators were essentially held hostage by public demand. The wooden sword would be presented with great fanfare. You were now a rudiarius, a freed gladiator. Congratulations, you'd survived the unsurvivable. But what exactly had you won? Freedom. Yes, but freedom to do what? You were still infamous. That social death sentence didn't get lifted just because you'd bled enough to satisfy the crowd. You still couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, couldn't testify in most legal proceedings. Many public burial grounds still wouldn't accept your corpse. You'd gone from being a living weapon to being a living embarrassment. Your skill set was also remarkably non-transferable. After years of training to kill people entertainingly, what exactly were you qualified to do in civilian life? Your resume would read, experienced in theatrical violence, crowd management, and not dying. Skills include sword work, bleeding professionally, and making murder look good for spectators. References available from anyone who saw me not die at the Colosseum. Many rudiarii stayed in the gladiator business because it was the only world they knew. Some became trainers, doctors, passing on their survival skills to the next generation of arena fodder. It was a grim irony, spending your freedom teaching others how to lose theirs, but it paid well, and what else were you going to do? Your expertise in the Thracian fighting style wasn't exactly useful for farming or shopkeeping. Others became referees, summa rudis, overseeing the fights they once participated in. Imagine spending your freedom watching other men go through the same hell you'd barely survived, holding the stick that enforced the rules that might have killed you. But again, it was employment, and employment that your infamous status didn't disqualify you from. The luckiest Rudiari found work as bodyguards for wealthy Romans. Your reputation as a survivor of the arena was actually an asset here. Nobody wanted to mess with someone who'd killed people for a living and had the scars to prove it. Some gladiators became quite wealthy in this role, protecting paranoid politicians who valued proven killers over social respectability. But here's the really twisted part. Many Rudiari returned to the arena voluntarily. The most famous example was Flamma, a Syrian gladiator who was offered the Rudis 4 times and refused it each time. He fought 34 times, won 21, fought to a draw 9 times, and was defeated, but granted Missio 4 times. He died in the arena at age 30, having spent his entire adult life as a gladiator by choice. Why would anyone do this? Why would you refuse freedom to continue risking your life for entertainment? The answers are complex and depressing. For some, it was financial. Prize money for successful gladiators could be substantial, and if you'd built up a reputation, you could command high fees. When your only other options were menial labor or begging, the arena might actually offer better prospects. For others, it was psychological. After years in the arena, some gladiators became addicted to the adrenaline, the crowd's adoration, the simplicity of kill or be killed. The real world, with its complex social rules and your permanent status as an outcast, might have seemed more terrifying than facing another secutor. At least in the arena, the rules were clear and your enemies obvious. There was also the problem of identity. After years of being a gladiator, who were you without it? The arena had destroyed your old identity and replaced it with a new one. You were no longer Marcus the farmer or Gaius the soldier. You were the Thracian or Destroyer or whatever stage name you'd fought under. Taking off that identity was like peeling off your own skin. Some Rudiari tried to reintegrate into normal society. They married, usually to women of equally low status. No respectable family would accept a gladiator as a son-in-law, had children, tried to build normal lives, but the stigma followed them everywhere. Their children bore the shame of their father's infamia. Their wives were mocked as gladiators' women. They were forever marked by their past. The psychological damage was permanent. Modern soldiers returning from war often struggle with PTSD, and they at least have the framework of serving their country to help process their experiences. Gladiators had killed for entertainment. They'd turned human death into performance art. How do you process that? How do you explain to your children why Daddy flinches at sudden movements or wakes up screaming names of men he killed? Some Rudiari simply disappeared, leaving Rome entirely to try building new lives in distant provinces where their past might not follow. But even there, the scars, physical and mental, marked them. A man covered in the distinctive wounds of gladiatorial combat couldn't easily hide his past. And in a world where reputation and social standing were everything, that past was a life sentence. The wooden sword, that symbol of freedom, was really just another kind of chain. It freed you from the arena, but not from what the arena had made you. You were free to leave, but not free to belong anywhere else. Free to live, but not to live as a full person. Free to remember, but not to forget. The true cruelty of the gladiatorial system wasn't just that it killed people. It was that even survival came with a cost that could never be fully paid. The Rudis granted freedom from fighting, but not freedom from being a gladiator. That identity, burned into you by years of blood and sand, was yours forever, a tattoo on your soul that no amount of time could fade. The gladiatorial games weren't just entertainment. They were politics by other means. Every drop of blood spilled in the arena served a political purpose. And understanding this is crucial to grasping the full scope of why being a gladiator sucked so monumentally. You weren't just fighting for your life, you were a prop in the grand theater of Roman power. The phrase, bred in circuses, panem et circenses, has become shorthand for using entertainment to distract the masses, but it was much more sophisticated than simple distraction. The games were a complex political tool that served multiple functions simultaneously. They were propaganda, social control, religious ritual, and campaign rally, all rolled into one blood-soaked package. For Roman politicians, sponsoring games was like running a super PAC, except instead of attack ads, you funded actual attacks. An ambitious politician could buy public support more effectively with a good gladiator show than with any policy proposal. The math was simple. The more spectacular your games, the more the people loved you. The more the people loved you, the more political power you accumulated. The more power you had, the more spectacular games you could afford. It was a virtuous cycle built on a foundation of corpses. The emperor took this to its ultimate extreme. Imperial games weren't just big, they were statements of divine power. When Trajan celebrated his victory over the Dacians, his games lasted 123 days and involved 10,000 gladiators. The message wasn't subtle. I am so powerful I can orchestrate death on an industrial scale for your amusement. The fact that many of those gladiators were probably Dacian prisoners of war added an extra layer of political meaning. Every dead Dacian in the arena was a reminder of Roman victory, a miniature reenactment of the conquest. The game served as a pressure valve for social tensions. Rome was a city of massive inequality, where the ultra-wealthy lived in unimaginable luxury, while the poor crowded into insulae, apartment buildings that regularly collapsed or burned down. The games gave the masses a chance to feel powerful, to decide life and death with their voices, to participate in the grandeur of empire, even if they'd never share in its wealth. But it was a carefully controlled participation. The seating arrangement in the amphitheater was a physical manifestation of social hierarchy. The emperor and senatorial class sat closest to the action, in the shade with cushioned seats. The equestrian class sat behind them. Ordinary citizens were further back, and women, slaves, and the poorest sat in the nosebleed sections, squinting at tiny figures bleeding in the distance. Even in the democracy of death, hierarchy was maintained. The emperor's box, Pulvinar, was positioned so everyone could see him. He was both spectator and spectacle, watching the games while being watched by the crowd. His reactions, approval, disapproval, mercy, condemnation, were part of the show. A good emperor knew how to read the crowd, when to grant mercy to seem compassionate, when to demand death to seem strong. It was political theater where the stakes were actual lives. The religious dimension added another layer of political meaning. The games had originated as funeral rites, and they maintained a religious character. They were often dedicated to the gods or held in honor of deceased members of the imperial family. This gave them a sacred gloss that made opposition difficult. Criticizing the games wasn't just questioning entertainment, it was borderline sacrilege. The games also served as a display of imperial resources and reach. Every exotic animal killed demonstrated the empire's ability to project power to distant lands. Every condemned criminal executed showed the inexorable nature of Roman justice. Every gladiator fight reenacted Roman military superiority. The arena was a microcosm of empire, where Roman order triumphed over chaos, civilization over barbarism, discipline over wildness. For the gladiators themselves, this political dimension added another layer of horror to their existence. They weren't just fighting, they were unwilling actors in a political drama they had no control over. A Gallic gladiator forced to fight in the Gallic style was performing his own people's defeat. A criminal executed in the arena was demonstrating the power of Roman law. Even volunteer gladiators were showing that Roman society could compel free men to choose slavery and death. The timing of games was politically calculated. They might be held to celebrate military victories, to mark imperial anniversaries, or to distract from unpopular policies or disasters. When things went wrong, a military defeat, a grain shortage, a plague, the prescription was often more games. It was governance by spectacle, solving political problems with blood. The crowd itself became a political force. One of the few places where ordinary Romans could make their voices heard en masse was the amphitheater. They could cheer or boo the emperor, demand mercy or death, express approval or disapproval. Smart emperors paid attention to these moods. The arena became a kind of violent opinion poll, where public sentiment was measured in decibels and death. This created bizarre situations where gladiators' lives hung on political calculations that had nothing to do with their performance. An emperor wanting to seem merciful might spare losers regardless of how poorly they'd fought. One wanting to seem tough might condemn crowd favorites. Your survival could depend on whether the emperor had had a fight with his wife that morning or whether he needed to shore up support with the plebs. The internationalization of the games added another political dimension. As the empire expanded, games were held throughout the provinces, exporting Roman culture and values. Local elites would sponsor games to demonstrate their Romanization and loyalty to the empire. A gladiator fight in Britain or Syria wasn't just entertainment. It was a statement that this land was now Roman, subject to Roman law and Roman customs. Even the architecture of amphitheaters was political. These massive structures dominated urban landscapes, permanent reminders of Roman power and the violent entertainment it could provide. Building an amphitheater was a statement of civic pride and imperial loyalty. The structures themselves, with their careful crowd control and hierarchical seating, were physical manifestations of Roman social order. The gladiator, standing in the sand, was at the center of all this political meaning, but had no control over any of it. He was a living symbol manipulated by forces beyond his comprehension or influence. His life and death served purposes he might never understand, advancing careers he'd never benefit from, reinforcing systems that classified him as subhuman. This political exploitation might have been the cruelest aspect of gladiatorial life. It wasn't enough that you suffered and died for entertainment. Your suffering and death were also tools of statecraft, instruments of social control, props in the grand performance of Roman power. You bled not just for the crowd's amusement, but for the stability of an empire that saw you as disposable. Every gladiator who died in the arena died for Rome, not as a hero defending the homeland, but as a sacrifice on the altar of political expediency. Their blood lubricated the gears of a system that needed spectacular violence to function. They were martyrs to entertainment, casualties of a political system that had discovered the power of weaponized spectacle. So here we are, at the end of our blood-soaked journey through the reality of gladiatorial life. We've stripped away Hollywood's glamorous lies and revealed the truth underneath. Being a gladiator was one of history's worst career choices, a life that managed to combine all the worst aspects of slavery, celebrity, and violence into one spectacularly miserable existence. Let's do a final accounting of just how comprehensively ruined you were as a gladiator. Legally, you were non-existent. The moment you became a gladiator, whether by capture, condemnation, or that catastrophically bad decision to volunteer, you acquired the status of infamous. You joined the ranks of prostitutes, actors, and pimps as someone so disgraceful that the law barely recognized you as human. You couldn't vote, couldn't testify in court, couldn't hold office, and couldn't even be buried with decent people. This wasn't a temporary punishment. It was a permanent scarlet letter that followed you even if you somehow survived to win your freedom. Physically, you were destroyed. Your body was deliberately modified for entertainment value, fattened up to bleed more impressively, trained to fight in ways that looked good rather than effective, repeatedly injured and patched up just enough to fight again. You were a living special effect, your suffering calibrated for maximum visual impact. The excellent medical care you received was just elaborate maintenance on a machine designed to break. Psychologically, you were tortured. The ludus forced you into bonds of brotherhood with men you might have to kill. You formed friendships that existed under constant threat of being tested in the most horrific way possible. You lived with the knowledge that your best friend might be your next opponent, that the man teaching you to survive might be the one you'd have to stab for the crowd's amusement. It was emotional torture, refined to an art form. Economically, you were exploited. Despite generating massive wealth for Lannister, editors, and the entire ecosystem built around the games, you received almost nothing. Your life was commodified, your death potentially more valuable than your survival. Even if you earned prize money, your infamous status meant you couldn't fully participate in the economy. You were a cash cow that wasn't allowed to own the farm. Socially, you were paradoxical. You might be famous, with your name scratched on walls and your image on lamps, but you were simultaneously untouchable. Women might lust after you, but respectable ones wouldn't marry you. People might cheer for you, but they wouldn't eat with you. You were a celebrity pariah, worshipped and reviled in equal measure. Professionally, you were trapped. Your skills were non-transferable to any legitimate career. You were trained for one thing: spectacular violence. Even if you survived to receive the rudis, your options were basically to teach others to do what you did, referee while others did it, or return to doing it yourself. The arena never really let you go. Politically, you were a tool. Your life and death served agendas you had no part in setting. You were a prop in the theater of Roman power, your blood greasing the wheels of political machines. Whether you lived or died might have less to do with your skill than with what message the emperor wanted to send that day. Existentially, you were erased. Your previous identity was obliterated, replaced with a stage persona. You became the Thracian, or the Netman, your actual name and history irrelevant. Even if you survived, you could never fully reclaim who you'd been before the arena remade you. The genius of the gladiatorial system was how it took all these different forms of exploitation and wove them together into an inescapable web. Each strand reinforced the others. Your legal status made economic exploitation easier. Your economic situation made it harder to escape. Your training made you unsuitable for other work. Your infamy made social rehabilitation impossible. It was a perfectly designed trap, a machine for producing entertaining death. But perhaps the ultimate insult was how your suffering was transformed into culture. Gladiatorial games weren't seen as the systematic torture they were. They were considered art, religion, politics, and entertainment all rolled into one. Philosophers wrote about their meaning. Poets composed verses about famous fighters. Artists decorated homes with scenes of combat. Your misery became civilization's entertainment. Your degradation transformed into cultural achievement. The Romans built an empire on many things: military might, engineering genius, legal innovation, but they also built it on the broken bodies of gladiators. The games weren't a sideshow to Roman civilization, they were central to it. They were how Rome talked to itself about power, virtue, life, and death. And that conversation required a constant supply of human suffering. So when we watch our sanitized Hollywood versions of gladiators with their stirring speeches about honor and freedom, remember what we're really romanticizing. We're taking one of history's most elaborate systems of human exploitation and turning it into popcorn entertainment. We're doing exactly what the Romans did, transforming real suffering into spectacle, just with better special effects and craft services. The gladiator's life sucked in ways that our modern minds can barely comprehend. It was suffering, industrialized, commodified, and packaged as entertainment. It was a life where your best hope was to die quickly and cleanly before the cumulative horror broke you completely. It was existence reduced to its most brutal economics: kill entertainingly or die trying. The men and women who lived this nightmare deserve better than our fantasies. They deserve to be remembered not as heroes or villains, but as human beings caught in one of history's most elaborate machines of exploitation. They were people who laughed, cried, formed friendships, felt fear, and tried to maintain some shred of humanity in conditions designed to strip it away. Their legacy isn't one of glory, it's one of endurance in the face of systematic dehumanization. They were living proof that humans can survive almost anything, even when survival might be worse than death. They showed that even in the most degrading circumstances, people form bonds, create meaning, and maintain dignity where none should exist. The gladiators are gone, their blood long since washed from arena sands. But their story remains, a testament to the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance. They remind us that civilization and barbarity aren't opposites. They can coexist, even reinforce each other. They warn us that entertainment and exploitation can wear the same mask, that spectacle can blind us to suffering. Most of all, they remind us that behind every historical spectacle were real people with real lives, real pain, and real deaths. People whose suffering shouldn't be forgotten in our rush to be entertained. People whose lives sucked in ways we're still trying to fully understand. Centuries after the last gladiator raised his finger in surrender and hoped for mercy that might never come.